Okay, so I want to talk about bias in the psychic community or the spiritual community or whatever you want to call it. Basically, there's typically this, two poles regarding it. Usually, this sort of um, anti-white narrative, right? You'll have black identified people in the psychic community um, saying something like, the sun's going to wipe out the evil white identified people, or some narrative similar to that, right? Which I just feel is fairly unfounded and misguided and kind of pointless, especially now. And I also sort of question their agendas or perception because there's just too much sort of nature and reincarnation for that to make sense, right? Basically, a lot of Black identified people are reincarnated white identified people. Okay, so those grudges, that animosity is sort of, it's almost like being angry at yourself, having animosity towards yourself. Because again, a lot of Black identified people are reincarnated white identified people. Um, Basically, let's say just using this modern time period as sort of a frame of reference. Um, a lot, first of all, um, there was a sort of shared experience. What I mean is that we took turns, okay, in this sort of hard, difficult timeline. In a sense, we took turns, meaning Black identified people reincarnated as white people, and white people identified people reincarnated as Black people, as in this taking turns type of way, right? I'm saying there's was some level of design that white identified people seemingly had an easier experience because it was like taking a break, right? You had this Black identified experience, and then you will reincarnate as a white identified person as sort of taking a break. We took turns, okay, through this experience. And that's not saying things never sort of got out of line and where sort of animosity and grudges are sort of earned, but mostly it would be pointless to have this sort of animosity and grudge because most Black identified people are reincarnated white identified people. Okay. Then there was another sort of aspect of that where a lot of less newer souls, less experienced souls reincarnated as white identified people as the way in that, because that makes it more fair. Okay. If we could say that Black identified experience is was sort of like you have to swim laps using the butterfly stroke or something. Okay. It wouldn't make sense. It would be more fair to have to incarnate those people as people who had experience doing laps using the butterfly stroke. Okay, so more experienced white identified people reincarnated as Black identified people because they have more experience. It wouldn't be un- it would be less fair if we threw these people who've never done laps using the butterfly strokes into this butterfly stroke lap experience. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So, generally speaking, right, newer souls, less experienced souls, reincarnated at, right? This was happening simultaneously, okay? So, and this is generally speaking, right? There are Black identified people who are sort of newer souls and less experienced souls. And there's white identified people, currently speaking, that are, very experienced souls. And when I say experience, this is not about grade or rank or hierarchy, right? Some people will say, like, I'm an older soul, which I believe we're just sort of projecting this sort of aspects of Gaianhood onto nature, because I don't believe souls really have age, right? But we can have experience. There could be more experienced souls, but not in that ranking hierarchy way, right? In that same sense, that's like someone who's like experienced in karate, they can be beaten by someone who's less experienced in karate. Okay, it's only relative or no even noticeable sometimes, some places. Okay, but that was sort of the setup in a sense. This sort of checks and balances type of system, if you will. Okay. So, you know what I'm saying? And, and then now that's during this cosmic reset, that's becoming less relevant because we're all going to be experiencing sort of um something new. Okay. And but that was the general sort of experience, right? Again, this sort of taking turns, this sort of cyclical reincarnation between black and white identified people, right? And then this, right, black identified people having this sort of hard experience is just sort of seemingly, right? Again, it's like that doing the butterfly stroke, doing laps. But black identified people had experience doing butterfly strokes and laps, right? A lot of this was just, it was almost this sort of astral plan in a sense, right? Because a lot of this was just going to be inevitable, but we kind of knew what we were getting ourselves into before we entered this sort of binary black and white timeline. Okay. In this sort of astral contract sense, right? And now that this astral contract is sort of ending, okay, it's really um pointless and misguided to have this sort of animosity or grudge. Okay. And then just as a side note, um, if all white identified people vanish off the face of the planet tomorrow, it wouldn't be this utopia. Okay. Some black identified people, some of these biased black identified people sort of act that way as if it would just be this magical utopia, but it wouldn't really, it wouldn't be. Okay. There's no any sort of shadowy or sinister behavior. It's not exclusive to any of these sort of, you know, constructed populations in a sense. Okay. And then if anything's sort of extra is coming from these sort of identified populations, it's sort of, it's just a Gaian people behavior. What I mean is, generally speaking, white identified people are less experienced, okay, and having more sort of delicate constitution. Not again, not in this sort of ranking hierarchy way, not in this weak way, but in this, in that how birds have hollow bones type of way, right? They traded that to gain flight. Okay. But so anything extra is just coming from that less experience and more delicate constitution. If these black identified people were less experienced and had a more delicate constitution, you would be doing those same things. So when you factor that all in, um, nothing sort of extra is happening. It's just and that's not like saying like that's a totally like free pass in a sense. I'm just saying that um it's sort of there's just uh that shadowy corrupt Gaian behavior is found can be found in anyone, and that seemingly extraness is not extra. Basically, no one sort of owes anyone anything. Okay, that sort of astral balance has basically been canceled out. Okay, but then there's also sort of a flip side to this as well. So generally, when it's coming from these sort of black biased, black identified people, it's more straightforward, blunt, right? But there's also this sort of toxic activity that comes from these white identified people in the spiritual or psychic communities. Okay, it's just typically more passive or indirect, and it's that um, connotating white and light with good and dark and black with bad. Okay, when that's not just sort of fundamentally biased, but then there's just the whole astral and psychic um, effects of that, right? We know that there's people who can be identified as dark and black, and then we're connotating, associating, you know, transmitting that as, you know, bad. And then we know that there's people who can be identified as white or light, and then we're connotating that with good. Okay. So, right, this is both sort of aggressive, toxic activity. Some of it is just more aggressive, and some of it is just more passive aggressive, but I would say it's equally um, toxic. Okay. So, I would suggest that, you know, right, some people just seem to be getting caught in these cosmic roles, this cosmic theater a little too much, especially when we're exiting this timeline, which was this sort of duality play, right? This binary, this polarized um, sort of experience, but we're moving away from that, right? From this, we're moving out of more into non-duality. Okay, so I would kind of question people who are still identifying, you know, as colors. Okay.